Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, between the convergence of two rivers, the Raccoon and the Des Moines. This is The Uncommon Good. Bud, we have been up to our shenanigans for 9 years. Imogene Ingredients underwrites our show. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for making it possible. I am Bo Bonner. You might know me from the Catholic Morning Show, if you listen to Iowa Catholic Radio 5 days a week. Bud, who is this man? What do you tell them?
I'm Bud Marr, Dean at Mercy College of Health Sciences, downtown Des Moines, and I am excited about today's interview.
It is always exciting to have this guy on, Charlie Camosy. He has been a true Uncommon Good all-star.
But he's like a really gracious Uncommon Good all-star. We're grateful for all of them. But really one of the leading voices in bioethics, and he's generously come on the show several times.
Absolutely. He's made it to Des Moines multiple times, right, and dealing with a very, 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 very important issue. His new book is Living and Dying Well by Our Sunday Visitor. But he's talked about a host of these issues before, but I gotta say, this book, it's lean, mean fighting machine, right? It's not like this huge tome. It's particularly made to really get at these ideas in a way that a lot of people can read. I'm very impressed by this book, and I really do hope that if people have questions about things like physician-assisted, well, usually called suicide, but he points out should be physician-assisted killing, and the host of those issues, hospice, things like this, it really is the one-stop shop.
Yeah, I'd love to, just thinking out loud, find a way to get him back to Des Moines. Certainly get his book at Divine Treasures because, like you said, it's digestible. It's not a lengthy tome, and I think it's the best treatment of the foundational issues here.
That's what we're going to be talking to coming up next. It's The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you all with us. Today we have back on the show an Uncommon Good all-star, Dr. Charles Camosy, Living and Dying Well. It's out with Our Sunday Visitor Press. Charlie, thanks for coming on The Uncommon Good.
It's especially good to be with you because I listen to you guys when I'm doing yard work. So this is a surreal experience to actually be on the show again in my living room.
So, Charlie, of course, you have been at the forefront in ethics, in Catholic ethics, talking precisely about the whole host of issues that surrounds this book. But I want to say this book particularly really does seem a culmination of you overlapping multiple aspects of what your work has been for a long time.
There does seem to be a constellation of folks pushing in directions which lead us to say, yes, something we've said for a very long time, there's a culture of death. We need to respond to that culture of death by protecting those who are at risk. But even beyond that is a sense of, what is actually going on here, even beyond, a culture of death? I think for many people, ironically, and I point this out in the book, it's a refusal to engage with death. It's a refusal to reckon with death. It's a pushing death outside of our consciousness and social consciousness that leads us to a situation where we might imagine towards the end of our lives, as we face the end of our lives, saying, well, here's one last attempt to push my own autonomy, my own will to power, my own autonomous sense of who I am in the face of death by saying, I'm going to take my own life, or I'm going to work with a physician to take my own life. And so there's a paradox here, right? Yes, it's a culture of death. Yes, it's a response to death, to take it into one's own hands. But in another way, it really is a failure to reckon with the very notion of death itself and our finitude and limitations in the face of it.
People think they're serving a different master, but there's actually a villain behind who they think they're serving. And that's how this paradox lines up, right? They're scared of death, and they're inadvertently serving him through these, as it were, middlemen managers that seem to be opposed to death but are not. But at this point, something different is starting to happen, and I think you're right that it starts to be this Janus-faced, we are absolutely scared of death, so we're going to go ahead and choose death. The worries about death and acting like there's no way we should ever die has gone full circle to where people are like, so I'm just going to choose death early. Do you see that sort of change in the span of your career?
Yeah, I definitely do. And in this case, in this set of topics that I wrote about in this book, one way it's revealed, I think, is in the populations that both support it, but especially in the populations support it as a quote-unquote right, but also those who avail themselves of it. So it's almost exclusively, and there are some exceptions, but the numbers are like in the 90%. It's almost exclusively people of privilege, people who are white, people who have a good deal of education, people who have a good deal of resources to take advantage of this. People, in short, who think of themselves as in control of their own lives, right? Unlike others who know much better that we're not. And Christians, of course, if we think about this rightly, know that we're not as well, of our very natures as finite beings who owe everything to God, obviously, and who don't own our lives and aren't, and who reject this idea, this Western individualistic idea of autonomy. But what we find is, I mean, just to put this into some kind of perspective, New Jersey has had, my adopted home state of New Jersey has had physician-assisted killing since, I think, at least 5 or 6 years. I don't know exactly what it is. The first black person to actually use it just used it last year. It's been overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly privileged. Lily White, Oregon, has had it since the 90s. That's no accident. I mean, this is something that we see over and over again. In fact, it's communities of color that have pushed back against these practices in very interesting and revealing and important ways by saying, this thing that privileged people tend to see as uncomplicated, like hospice, we see this as a really bad thing, or at least a really problematic thing, because of how it functions in our communities and how the distrust of medicine, for good reason, over the centuries, over the decades, has really pushed us into a position where we rightly have this kind of negative reaction. Okay, what's going on here exactly when you say that we're not feeding grandma anymore? Right. What's going on here when my uncle is getting this level of morphine? Or what's going on here this particular care home when I visit, it seems like they're not getting the care they should, or they're getting bed sores or whatever it is. So if we, once again, an example where we can point to those on the margins, the positions of those on the margins, the experience of those on the margins, for the wisdom to really engage these issues rightly.
Charlie, I can imagine some listeners hearing this conversation and thinking, well, I'm personally opposed to this, but is it that big of a deal? It feels sort of out of sight. In the book, you unpack how in Canada, it's like 4% of all deaths now, and it's in the top 5 of like causes of deaths in different places. The Netherlands, we've seen similar drifts. And then, beyond that, it seems like sometimes when these laws are passed that it will, like there's this idea that it'll be like very strictly regulated, but there's this kind of drift where, all of a sudden it's open to minors or to those with mental health issues and things like this. I think this ties into, early in the book, you say you're going to use the phrase physician-assisted killing.
You took my point, bud.
Not physician-assisted suicide. Could you talk about that some?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we've discussed on your show before, but just the language we use to describe things like this just becomes so important. When you think about medical aid and dying as a euphemism for these things, you think about the case of Brittany Maynard, somebody who in California wanted assisted suicide because she had a brain tumor, right? And she was not able to get it, and so she went to Oregon, and Compassionate Choices, the former Hemlock Society, sprung into action, and so did all their subservient, media organizations who pushed that story out in a way that led eventually to California in 2015, I believe, legalizing physician-assisted killing. Now, most cases are not like those cases. Most cases of physician-assisted suicide don't involve this kind of brain tumor type situations. We can talk about those cases. But the overwhelming majority of cases have almost nothing to do with the physical pain caused by a brain tumor. They have things much more to do with what some might call existential suffering, like a fear of loss of autonomy. Given what I just said in my previous answer, it's understandable why people who fear their loss of autonomy or even imagine themselves having autonomy in the first place are more geared towards these kind of things. anyway, once you open the door to saying, well, this really isn't about, overwhelming physical pain and suffering, it's about existential suffering, you just naturally have that kind of slippage, right? Like, how can you say to the person who has dementia that we can give it for you, but somebody suffering from anorexia or bulimia, we don't give it for you? Or even sexual assault. There have been cases of people suffering from mental illness related to sexual assault in the Netherlands who've been able to request it and get it. In Canada, there was this terrible story but revealing story, and shows the intersection with social and economic justice at the heart of this as well, and justice for vulnerable populations at the heart of this as well. A poor woman was in public housing in Canada, and she had this terrible reaction to something toxic in her public housing, probably the paint or some other issue with her environment there, and it was just overwhelming for her. She couldn't really handle it. And she contacted the authorities and said, "Can you give me a second option here when it comes to where I can live? Because I can't handle this." And they said, "No, we can't give you new housing, but we will offer you." Guess what? Altogether now, medical aid in dying.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, give me a freaking break, right? What are we talking about? Medical aid in dying? That's physician-assisted killing. That is not medical aid in dying, and that is a horrible injustice, but it's an injustice that follows from the trajectory we put ourselves on here.
Well, in our bioethics class at Mercy College, Bo and I talked about how this is where our society is kind of schizophrenic because, you could drive to like Fort Dodge here in Des Moines, and there's a billboard when you enter about if you're feeling suicidal to seek help. And when we talk about those matters, like say the prevalence of this among those who have served in combat, we talk about a suicidal epidemic. We know there's this sort of like mimetic character to it, unfortunately. And then at the same time, we sort of like pass around memes about Robin Williams or whatever, and say like we kind of celebrate certain occasions where that sort of killing is taking place. And that's where I wonder, like, maybe that can be a point of traction with those who are not persons of faith, where we can point to areas in our society where it's like, no, we're trying to prevent the spread of this activity from happening.
I totally agree with you about that, but I think as you know, I think a lot about how to make common cause with people who otherwise disagree about this, and an anti-suicide focus, which is virtually everywhere else, but in this set of issues, is a place to do this. I'm so moved, as I'm sure both of you have been, to see the photos that went viral online about people that show people literally wrapping themselves around people about to jump off a bridge or something like this. Have you seen these kind of photos?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sometimes they even I think in one case, somebody took off their belt and wrapped the belt around the person so they couldn't jump. I mean, talk about, overruling somebody's bodily autonomy, their right to do what they want with their own bodies. Not only is this not considered bad, it's, heroic. It's beautiful. The reason why these things go viral is because everyone can see, or virtually, everyone can see the beauty in overriding this individual's autonomy to say, no, I don't care what you think about your life right now. We're going to make the judgment that your life is worth saving. Your life is worth protecting, including from yourself. And we will physically wrap ourselves around you until the authorities can force you out of this dangerous situation in which you put yourself. Now, the counter argument to that is, well, we just assume someone like that is, not making an autonomous decision. Maybe they're crazy or something, and then we're preventing that. But that's just not something that's a fact and evidence for these situations. What I think is actually going on here, and really, really interesting, I think, to explore, is we can look and see that person is like a healthy, able-bodied person. Right. Mm-hmm. They have a life that we would sort of look at and say, maybe, well, I can see why that person should continue to live. Whereas if we look at more vulnerable population, more disabled populations, more diseased populations, sometimes we have as a culture a different sort of reaction. We say, well, I can sort of understand why you would want to kill yourself if you were in that situation, so why don't we go ahead and allow it? And of course, disability rights groups come up and say, whoa, wait a minute, what are you saying about people like me, right? When you make it legal to kill people like me, for people like me to cooperate with physicians to kill themselves, you're saying you can sort of understand why someone like me would want to be killed.
Yes, and to me there is sort of a two-handed approach that gets us into this moral, incomprehensible position where it seems like if you imagine these ethical considerations on a map, it's like the moral reasoning in the sort of northeast quadrant isn't the same in the southwest quadrant, as it were, right? Like because of positivism in ethical consideration, and not to go too much into like an introduction to ethics class, but when you have this idea that there isn't principles that must be foundational to your argument, your moral argumentation, what you eventually only get is sort of like the consideration, as it were, in this one small quadrant, and you see people talk themselves into moral positions that they would not hold if the context was different, even in slight ways. And so to your point, especially if there is unrecognized context that make those positivistic statements change, like, for instance, class or disability or straight up racism or sexism or things like this, people are able to seem logically, well, I wouldn't even say logically, they seem morally consistent in the sort of really narrow box they're considering the question in, even if all around the rest of the other boxes, they would come to a completely different conclusion. And so this two-handed thing gets us to the problem that we have. If you believe there are no principles that ethics ultimately has to answer to, you can do this. You don't bat an eye to think that I'm going to consider ethics radically differently depending on the situation, because I don't think there's anything common to all of those quadrants. And then on the other hand, if we're not attuned to looking at the understated, the unlooked at, the unacknowledged aspects that make us think some lives are worth living but not others, this really does start to be why we can make proclamations with, like you're saying, a lot of sort of public agreement about the compartmentalization because of those sort of moral failings in the way we even see the problems.
Oh, I totally agree with everything you said, and I think it shows up again and again in responses that probably we've all seen online or even in conversations about these topics with folks who sometimes will respond not with even a judgment about the individual themselves, but really about the individual in question in the case, but something about themselves, right? They'll respond by saying, well, if I were in a situation like that, I would certainly want the right to kill myself, right? And so that, for all the reasons you suggested, that compartmentalization feeds, again, this kind of myth of autonomy, myth of control, myth of understanding ours as a life that is owned by us rather than a gift from God over which we are stewards, not owners.
Charlie, we have about 3 minutes left on this first segment, and I'm going to risk opening a big can of worms. But so going back to teaching bioethics, and for myself, it wasn't part of my integral formation. It's something that I sort of had to do a crash course in when I came to Mercy. It felt to me anecdotally that the young people in our classes sort of were more open to resisting abortion, through sonography and things like this. They sort of had a visceral grasp of the child in the womb, but had a harder time making sense of why you wouldn't use physician-assisted suicide in some cases. First, question one, do you think that's a fair assessment of where young people are at today? Do we know? And then secondly, I've already kind of broached this, but when it comes to gaining traction with people who are not, persons of faith, have you seen conversions or eye openings? And the reason I ask is your book, I loved it. It's it's bathed in sort of a very Catholic view of the world. But I'm just thinking about we've seen this kind of trend in pro-life, abortion politics, where secularists have become open to joining the cause. What do we see in this area?
Well, I do with many of my students see the dynamic you mentioned in your first part there. With regard to your second part, I guess I want to invoke, speaking of quadrants, let's talk about geographical quadrants maybe, or geographical areas. I'm a Midwest boy, but I've been living out on the East Coast for almost 2 full decades now. And one thing I've been very surprised by is the resilience of anti-physician assisted killing out here. Deep blue states on the East Coast like Connecticut have rejected it for 14 years in a row. Maryland, 10 years in a row. New York, until this year, had a decade of resisting it year in, year out, and still not clear what Governor Hochul is going to do, whether she's going to sign it or not. It was actually passed by the New York legislature months ago, and she has still not signed it, so it's not clear what she's going to do. And the UK is going through this right now. The House of Commons passed it, but the House of Lords has deep questions about it, and in the Midwest, deep blue states like Illinois and Minnesota have rejected it in the past year. So there are ways in secular, for lack of a better way of saying it, progressive, democratic, blue state places where these arguments work, outside of a Catholic context, obviously, or at least the fullness of the Catholic context. And so I think appeals to disability communities, appeals from disability communities, disabled populations rolling themselves up in their wheelchairs to testify in front of these health committees are incredibly powerful. Also, the Secular American Medical Association recently took yet another vote on whether to accept physician-assisted killing, and the delegates overwhelmingly rejected it. So the very secular American Medical Association says this is incompatible with the very notion of healing itself, which is obviously true. So that's the short answer to your question. I know we're over time for this segment, but that's where I would put my hope in trying to bridge outside of a Catholic context.
We're speaking with Charlie Camosy. His book is Living and Dying Well from OSV Press. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We're going to be right back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show and making it all possible. We're back talking with Dr. Charlie Camosy, his new book, Living and Dying Well from OSV Press. What I think you do well in the book is try to say, let's get incarnational about this and say, let's talk about the reality of how people deal with death. One of the ways you do that is talk about things that are going on in the here and now, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you also go back in Catholic history and talk about 3 saints that we should see as embodiments of what it's like to approach death. So who are those saints, and how did you come about choosing them?
Well, there are just so many. Obviously, Memento Mori and the anticipation of death and the focus on a good death is sort of made a comeback in recent, last 10 years or so. But, it was it has been littered throughout our tradition, going all the way back to Jesus, of course, who asked us to keep our future death and the coming of the kingdom of God at our, at the front of our minds and hearts, because we know neither the day nor the hour. But I chose from a number of people, St. Francis, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, and the little flower, St. Teresa. I really, really, really was hard-pressed. It was a short book. They made me write a short book. People don't read books anymore. They do. It's short books that they read. So that's what I was coming up with. But, I don't know. St. Francis is obviously so capacious in his influence in so many ways. But one way that I don't think gets enough play and discussion, particularly in this context, is his finishing up of the Canticle of Creatures, right? From where Laudato Si comes, this notion of praising God for God's great gifts. One of the things I learned in my research for the book, and maybe you guys do this already, I didn't, was that he wrote that canticle over time. He added things as his life went on, and it was towards the end, as you might imagine, that he started thinking about things related to the end of life, for which he was to praise God. And you know what he ended up doing? He ended up saying, Laudato Si for sister death, he says, from whom no living man can escape. And it's this really evocative idea. What does it mean to praise God for sister death? I'm not still totally sure I know exactly what it means, but I know what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the kind of radical avoidance and death denial that we have in our current culture. It means something quite different from that. And boy, what to put into our context where we defer death, where we have, in fact, serious transhumanist attempts to escape death altogether, to have radical life extension, to upload ourselves to the cloud, to imagine that we can, have literally immortal lives on Earth that come from a technocratic paradigm. I know you guys have been focused on these kind of technological questions for some time now. The idea that we're praising God for sister death here blows up any concept of that technocratic paradigm towards immortality on this earth. I think what it evokes for me anyway is this idea that we are pilgrims on this earth, that it gives kind of meaning to our lives on this earth specifically as pilgrims. Death means that this is not our natural home, and we're on our way to something else, which is another thing that Jesus, of course, reminds us to keep in the front of our minds. When that happens, when we have this idea that death is in some ways an enemy, it's a paradox, right? Death is in some ways an enemy. Death comes through sin. But death is also in some ways a gift that we're given from God, and we're to welcome sister death in some ways. It's living in that paradox, living in that tension that I think can really break up some of our more harmful temptations along the lines we discussed in the first segment.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to point out you can't escape being paradoxical about death. If there's anything that, like, Martin Heidegger was right about, and he was wrong about lots, this idea, of course, being like Dasein, thrown into existence and having to deal with the fact that you will die, it's always going to end up being paradoxical if it's true. What's interesting, right, is with St. Francis in the sister death image, the paradox is it was our punishment, but through the cross, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the greatest of punishments becomes actually a portal to the greatest gift waiting for us. The alternate paradox, right, the one that, like, you had to choose between paradoxes, the other one is if you try to avoid sister death, you will end up serving her as your ultimate Lord. So you either accept the fact that this thing that was an originally, like you said, punishment for sin, but can be redeemed as a great gift if you accept it. But if you try to run from it, you will inadvertently end up serving it all of your days. And I do think that that's sort of the existential moment that St. Francis talking about sister death brings to light in that regard.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right to me. And to the extent that, I very rarely hear this preached about at Mass or at part of, a significant amount of our religious education. But I think we need, I think this is a really important part of the tradition, especially the Franciscan tradition. My kids happen to attend a school run by Franciscans, and so they have the annoying professor dad come in and talk to them about stuff like this, but which I need to do a little bit less of, I think. But this is not just for people who sit in a seminar class reading Being and Time together. This is a lesson that comes right out of the Scripture in our tradition, right out of perhaps our most famous and loved saint. Right out of the words of Christ himself, and needs to be, I think, more at the forefront of preaching, of education, of, just how we live our daily lives as Catholics.
The section on the saints is so powerful. Loved it. I know with the saints, sometimes I can feel like you encounter, we use the term hagiography, and you encounter the saints and see someone like St. Francis. Well, that's amazing. He had stigmata, he hung out with animals. Like, I don't know if I can live that out. And that's where, for me, like the book, it's powerful that you also point to heroic persons in the here and now who are sort of embodying this. And we've been saying all show, like, go out, buy the book. Yeah, like, you can only get the experience of the book that way, totally. But could you give us a snapshot of sort of like, in our contemporary context, like there are communities and persons who are really resisting the this culture of death?
In my Fordham incarnation, where I taught for 14 years, I started a new course that was a service learning bioethics course. One of the placements my students could choose from was a place called Calvary Hospice Center, or Calvary Hospice Hospital, which was there in the Bronx. And I got to know the staff and the leadership there pretty well over the years. And they were known for many things, but in particular, they were known for welcoming patients in their final days, weeks, months, sometimes years, in ways that kind of existential suffering that drives so much of physician-assisted killing, attempts to legalize and use physician-assisted killing. That kind of suffering just simply didn't exist, apparently, at Calvary Hospice Center because of the kind of love, the kind of community, the kind of welcome, the kind of encounters that were there, such that if you talk to Dr. Breska, who started it and recently died, but the culture is still very much there that he started, not a single patient ever requested anything like death by omission, by action. It just never was on their minds because their existential suffering was totally mitigated by the kind of love, by the kind of community, the kind of encounters that they had there. Their lives were considered valuable, and they were loved until their deaths. Lest that be just one example. I know there's so many others we could invoke. Another example I became aware of in the last few years is the L.A. Carmelites the Carmelites in Los Angeles who care for the elderly and dying in a couple of homes there. A very similar kind of reaction, a real embodied community, not just in a room with four walls and Fox News on the TV or something, but actual encounters with the staff, encounters with animals, encounters with the garden and nature outside, intentionally built in to their experience. Even, the kinds of encounters that I wish our parishes actually had more of. I think every parish should have what they have, which is an evening event they called Vespers in Vino, where they sing Vespers together and have wine after. These beautiful photos of the staff and very clearly elderly and even dying patients, in their walkers and wheelchairs, like holding up their glass of wine and with huge smiles and clearly part of a beautiful community. And when the time for death comes in that context, I've talked to some of the sisters about it, and everyone, to the extent that, because you can often tell when the dying process has started, the sisters gather around the person in their dying their dying moment and pray for them and hold them and touch them and kiss them. And even after death has happened, I was actually texting one of the sisters after my dad died, July 31st, and she said, I wish he would have been here so I could kiss his forehead and kiss his hands and kiss his feet, after he had died. I mean, that's the kind of part, like those people are coming out of a tradition, a Carmelite tradition, a St. Teresa tradition that has been with us for centuries, but is now more relevant than ever. And these are the things we need. Again, if we're going to put death into the front part of who we are, awareness of death, consciousness of death, memento mori, these are the kinds of things we need to highlight and replicate and do more of, it seems.
Again, not to make everything about technology, but I'm going to for a second. It's interesting that when you have a society, because of sort of like technological growth, where we have economic growth, we've done miraculous things where we're able to like feed a sheer amount of people on the planet Earth that we never have before. I'm going to make an analogy with education. When we take kids out of education from like K to 12 or even further into college, there's a real way where we are injuring economic potential. But the thing is, right, if what you're saying is, we should do this for utilitarian reasons because there'll be better workers afterwards, that doesn't necessarily follow. And we're getting ready to hit a world where maybe that's not even true because of what artificial intelligence is going to be able to do and take over. However, if as a society we go, you know what? Everything that we've done and everything we've achieved it's a crown jewel in a pinnacle of achievement that we're able to take our kids out of the workforce for multiple decades because learning is so good in and of itself that we'll expend other resources in order to give this time for our children. And so in an analogous way, instead of going, how do we use technology to make death more efficient, which is unfortunately where this is all heading. People are thinking about AI and how they can use that to help dementia patients. If instead we go, look, of all of the things we've accomplished as a species, why don't we let robots take over whatever work they can so we can all actually hang out with the dying? That's the thing that doesn't make sense, is it's literally possible to imagine in significant parts of the world to say, maybe we hand off to the computers things that we act like are important now, but truly aren't. And with the time saved, maybe we can actually attend to the dying and do right by the dead.
I totally agree with you, Bo. Before my dad's dying process, I was more in the camp of absolutely no robots ever, all human beings. I would joke to my kids about the things they're going to have to do for me when I'm in my dad's situation, But what I discovered during that time, and I think other people knew, and I just wasn't prepared to understand like you just articulated, is no, these technologies will be able to change people like my dad's undergarments every 15 minutes like it was necessary for him towards the end, and make his dying easier and better and more dignified, frankly, right? I think you just need to call it that. And make all of the nurses, all of his caregivers, all of his family more available to do the kinds of things that the Carmelite sisters do for their residents and their dying residents, right? And now, will there be slippage? Will there be a reason to worry that maybe, especially in a situation where care homes are owned by private capital and they're demanding returns on investment, that it might be the camel's nose, in the tent? Yes, I think there is a worry, and that's where I was originally, was saying absolutely not. But I think the stakes are too high, and the massive amount of labor. I don't think we should underscore just how much labor it takes to care for somebody well who's dying, and in many, not all, but in many contexts. If our technologies can take some of those labors and ease those labors such that we can genuinely encounter the dying, pray with the dying, kiss the dying, keep watch with the dying, then I think that's something we absolutely need to explore. And that's a change in my views, actually.
I think it's really appropriate that this interview is first airing in November. And, you've already kind of orbited around this topic, but when I think about dying well, which is so central to the entire book, anthropologists or literary critics like René Girard have pointed out that the foundation of culture in a lot of ways is the human experience of death. And some of the first archaeological sites that we see where human beings were gathering together, it was really funeraries and grave sites, right? And so in some ways there's this kind of impulse to memorialize or it is a significant moment even for, cultures that aren't as religious than the communities that we're a part of. And that's where, as faith has receded, I think you've seen some of this popping up in the broader culture. So just getting past the celebration of Halloween, the way that our yards are sort of marked by this reality. But that idea of dying well, I think what's a tough sell for some folks are when it's not something that you can all of a sudden pick up at the end of your life, Because, I think especially outside of a faith context, death very much feels like something that happens to us. And so, I'm, in some ways, individuals think well, I'll be completely passive in this process. And that's where the impulse to control kind of bubbles up, right? If I'm going to die well, then I have to have some level of agency, but I feel that agency receding. So I've thrown a lot out there, Charlie, but when we think about preparing to die well, what does that sort of look like?
Well, it's one of the themes of the book and you suggested it in your question, but God's grace can do wonders with human frailty, obviously, but the only real chance apart from that of dying well is living well first, right? With an eye towards dying well, and that's the theme of Cardinal Bellarmine. That's the theme of Saint Therese. That's the theme of Francis. That's the theme throughout the tradition. Is that the way, and of Christ Himself, obviously, right? The way to be prepared for a situation where you know neither the day nor the hour is to live a certain way, right? And it means to live a certain way with regard to one's wealth. It means to live a certain way with regard to one's family. It means to live a certain way with regard to one's community. And what's so interesting is when one lives a certain way with regard in the way the tradition asks us to live, it's not a guarantee that death will be like this, sort of wonderful, key, holy moment that is without any sort of burdens or pains or anything like that. Far from it. But it will almost certainly be something different from the sort of paradigmatic way that we die today, which is alone in four bare walls with Fox News on the TV, right? Which is, anything but a good death. So choices about where to live, how to live, how to engage with one's community. I was giving a talk on this recently, and a questioner in the Q&A had a very good idea. I think she said, this is something that pre-Cana preparation should really focus on. Like, how are we going to be around for our parents or our aunts and uncles or grandparents as part of our commitment to each other in a family, right? Again, focusing on living well in a particular way as individuals, as families, as communities. I have a chapter on each one in the book. It is almost a prerequisite, a necessary condition for dying well.
Absolutely. This book, folks, you have to go get it. Living and Dying Well by Charles Camosy, out with Our Sunday Visitor Press. Charlie, thank you as always for coming on The Uncommon Good.
No, thank you for The Uncommon Good. I love it. So thanks for having me on.
Blessings. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting the show. Bud, if even 1% of our shows could be as good as that interview was with Charlie Camosy, his new book, Living and Dying Well, we would be lucky indeed.
No, I mentioned this on the show, but I think it's a great conversation for this time of year. And we always say this on The Uncommon Good, but remember, especially during the month of November, to pray for the holy souls in purgatory. Throughout the year, you can join us in our prayer life. We pray, if you want to set your alarm super early, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy is aired at 4 a.m. That's followed by the Rosary. And then 6:30 a.m., 10 a.m., and 8:30 p.m., the Rosary is prayed again. In the afternoon, 2:57, you can join us in the Chaplet of Divine Mercy or hop on the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
You can go to iowacatholicradio.com also to do anytime, anywhere stuff. For instance, listen to programming like ours or any of the local shows that you didn't happen to hit. You can do that at the podcast page. You can go visit our business sponsors, give them a hat tip saying thank you for making shows like The Uncommon Good possible. But then, of course, folks, this ministry of Iowa Catholic Radio is not just the folks behind the mics, behind the boards, and behind the desk. It's your ministry as well. You make it possible through volunteering. Can't tell you how much our volunteers mean to us. Your prayers. There would not be 20 years of Iowa Catholic Radio without the prayers, but also with your material support. And you can support it still by calling or texting 515-223-1150 or going to iowacatholicradio.com, hitting the donate button, and safely and securely participating in making Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good possible. Bud, as always, salute to you. Enjoy your time in Rome. We can actually probably talk about that coming up soon. Great show today.
Yeah, thanks, Bo.
May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back next week.